Jesus of Nazareth, man who lived 2,000 years ago, but we still remember his story. He taught the people about God. It said that he performed incredible miracles, so large crowds began to follow him. But much of what he taught and did began to challenge the religious and political power structure of his time. So he was, of course, eventually arrested and ultimately brought before the Sanhedrin, and Caiaphas, the high priest, asked him a direct question. He said, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus answered, "I am." He was charged with blasphemy, sentenced to death by Pontius Pilate, crucified, and buried in a tomb. All of these facts are virtually undisputed by any serious biblical scholars or historians. Today, we're going to be looking at most closely is what happened next. Because if Jesus did, in fact, rise from the dead, then this proved what he said he was, the Son of God. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Don Larose, and I'm a deacon in the Archdiocese of Boston. And I'm excited to present to you today the evidence that Jesus rising from the dead isn't some ancient myth, but an actual, well-documented historical fact. It really happened. But have you ever wondered, well, how do we know? How do we know that Jesus did the miracles that are described in the Bible? And especially, how do we know that he rose from the dead? Where does the information come from? And very importantly, is it credible? And that brings us to also the question of miracles. To believe that Jesus rose from the dead, we have to believe in miracles. So are miracles possible, or are they just fantasy and foolishness? Today we're going to be looking at some scientific evidence that makes the case that God does truly exist, and therefore that miracles are possible. Then we're going to look closely at the sources of our evidence for Jesus' resurrection, the Bible, obviously a big one. But is it credible? One thing you won't hear me say today is, well, it's in the Bible, so therefore it must be true. Now the question is, why should we believe it? We'll also look at some other evidence that's from outside of the Bible. Is there information outside the Bible that mentions Jesus, that backs up some of the stories in the Bible, or is it contradicted? And then lastly, we're going to look at several key arguments that are based on the evidence that allow us to use our reasoning and judgment abilities to determine what is the most likely truth. As we look at this evidence, we're going to address a number of common myths, misunderstandings, and fallacies that impact our understanding of the evidence, such as that the people of the ancient world, well, they were primitive and unsophisticated, and therefore they were gullible, easily fooled. Anything they didn't understand, they attributed to a miracle. Or that the writings of the Bible were passed along verbally for many generations before finally being written down some hundreds of years later. That would obviously create a lot of room for creative editing and made up stories about miracles to be inserted into the writings. Or if you either read the book or saw the movie The Da Vinci Code, which I had a great book, an interesting movie. Love Tom Hanks, of course. But the character Lee, the older gentleman, he says at one point, he says, that Jesus was not considered to be divine by his followers until the year 325, when at the Council of Nicaea, they voted and said Jesus is God. And then the female lead, Sophie, she says, "You mean they didn't think Jesus was the Son of God?" And Lee says, "Not even a cousin twice removed." So you may remember that line, funny line, but that's totally incorrect, and I'll show you the evidence. So we're going to address all these things and a lot more. Well, let's kick things off by addressing that first misperception, and that is that the people in Jesus' time were very unsophisticated, uneducated. They weren't very smart. They didn't have iPhones, right? How smart can you be if you don't have an iPhone? And so when they didn't understand something, they just considered it a miracle, and that's where the stories from miracles in the Bible came from. Well, I'll submit to you that the people living in Jesus' time were every bit as intelligent as any of us here. Now, they didn't have all the same technologies that we have, but it took us 2,000 years of accumulated knowledge to get to the place where we have iPhones and rockets and TVs and so on. But in terms of their intelligence, every bit as smart. Let me give you some examples. Perhaps three of the most highly regarded philosophers to ever live, Socrates and his student Plato and his student Aristotle, they lived between 450 and 320 years before Jesus. Yet what they thought about, what they studied, and what they wrote are still studied in today's best universities. Even before that, around 500 BC, 500 years before Jesus, lived a man who is often credited with something that all of us studied in geometry class and still do today, the Pythagorean Theorem. Many of you probably remember what that was about. If you have a triangle with a 90-degree angle and you know the length of two sides, his calculation would tell you what the length of that third side is. You might even remember the calculation. It's a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And again, that was 500 years before Jesus. Even long before that, archaeologists have found a 3,700-year-old clay tablet that proves that the Babylonians, up in what is today Iraq, developed trigonometry some 1,700 years before Jesus. And they did it all without computers and without calculators. So yes, people living in Jesus' time could be very intelligent, even long before Jesus. But how sophisticated were they? I mean, did they all live in like little mud huts? And they hadn't quite figured out the wheel yet, so they had to walk everywhere and so on, like you see in some kind of the older movies. Well, no. This is a model of what Rome looked like in Jesus' time. Major metropolitan area. Had 1 million people that lived in Rome. That would be very similar to many of America's good-sized cities. It looks like Philadelphia to me. This is a model of an actual apartment building in Rome. Looks like Brookline. Doesn't have electricity, but they had running water and they had flushing toilets in Rome in Jesus' time. How about outside of Rome? This is a model of ancient Carthage in North Africa, what is now Tunisia. This is Rome's biggest adversary. They battled the Romans. The Carthaginians battled the Romans regularly. They built this very sophisticated protected harbor that could hold over 200 ships. And not little, again, a lot of movies about Jesus and so on, you see them on these little tiny sailboats. 200 ships. There's a story in the Acts of the Apostles that Luke writes about a trip that Paul takes, and he's shipwrecked. And in that shipwreck, there's 275 people on that boat with Paul. This harbor could hold over 200 ships of that size and that caliber. The Romans destroyed this 150 years before Jesus came. But if you Google it, you'll still see remnants of it today. How about Jerusalem, where much of our story takes place? This is a physical, three-dimensional model, actually, of Jerusalem in Jesus' day. You can see the people's legs up there at the top of the screen. Jerusalem had about 100,000 people that lived in it year-round, but it could swell to over 1 million people on the major festivals like Passover. That large rectangular structure in the back there is the beloved and famed temple. To give you a sense of scale, that wall on the right-hand side is 10 stories high. So think about a 10-story building in Boston, very large. This is another view of Jerusalem from the other side, looking over the other side of the temple. Again, now the flat part of the temple, the plaza area, is where sacrifices were made. People exchanged money to buy doves and things to be sacrificed and so on. To give you a sense of scale again, that flat part on top is the size of 6 football fields. The man who built that, King Herod, this is his palace in Jerusalem. Beautiful, very sophisticated. King Herod was considered to be a more sophisticated builder than the Romans were. The reason we're talking about these things is to talk about miracles. Were the people in Jesus' time unsophisticated, unintelligent, easily fooled? The people in Jesus' time would not be any more easily fooled than you or I if we were present for the same events they were at. So imagine you're at where Jesus turned water into wine just by blessing it, or healed a man who'd been crippled for 38 years just by touching him. If we were at those same events, we would have said the same thing they did. It's unexplainable, aka a miracle. Obviously, Jesus rising from the dead would be the most incredible miracle of all. In these modern times, I think it'd be pretty common to hear somebody say, look, I don't believe in miracles because I'm a person of science. I need facts, I need information, I need evidence, not a lot of mumbo jumbo. But did you know that the scientific objection to miracles being possible, whether they can actually happen, goes back centuries? Famous Scottish skeptic David Hume wrote in 1748 that miracles are a violation of natural law. Miracles can't happen because they violate natural law. So Jesus couldn't walk on water because gravity would have pulled him down. Can't violate that natural law. What's important to understand about natural laws is that natural laws describe our description of the natural pattern of nature, the things we observe happening. The natural laws don't determine what happens. Let me give you an example. So if I'm standing here with an apple, and I drop the apple, the law of gravity says it's going to do what? It's going to fall and hit the ground. However, if one of you were sitting close enough by and could reach out and grab that apple before it hit the ground, Did you violate the law of natural gravity? No. You just temporarily intervened in the result. In fact, you depended on gravity to bring it down to your hand. The point is here is that if there's a being, a God, a creator, who could create the entire universe, all the planets, all the stars, all the laws, including our world, you and I, right down to every last molecule, if there's a being that powerful, he or she could easily temporarily intervene in various events in human history. It wouldn't be a problem. In fact, the miracles as described in the Bible would be child's play for such a being. So if a God like that exists, then miracles are obviously possible. And not only possible, but probable. But then that begs the question, is there any scientific evidence that a being like that exists, that there's a God that exists? Well, yes. Interestingly, there is scientific evidence that shows that God does truly exist. Did you know that nearly all scientists today already do believe in something that's supernatural, something that's outside of nature? And that is, almost all scientists believe in the Big Bang, that the Big Bang created our universe. Now, the Big Bang Theory says that about 14 billion years ago, everything that exists, everything started from nothing. Nothing existed at all. But some single cause sparked all of time, space, and matter into being. Science tells us that everything that had a beginning had a cause. The universe had a beginning, therefore the universe had a cause. And the question is, what caused it? Albert Einstein, widely considered around the world to be the greatest scientist of all time. He described himself as a religious non-believer, said he didn't believe in God. So he became troubled in 1916 when his theories of general relativity meant that the universe was not eternal. The universe wasn't always there. It had a beginning. So he went and spent time in 1929 with Edwin Hubble, the creator of the modern telescope. And it confirmed what his theory predicted, that the universe was expanding outward from some central point. That discovery irritated Einstein. He said because it was counter to his philosophy about God. Albert Einstein, the world's greatest scientist ever lived, went on to believe that our universe was created by some kind of an intelligent being. Now there's another proof of God's existence that utilizes science and math. It's sometimes called the intelligent design theory because it says that every design had a designer. The universe has a highly complex design, and therefore the universe had a designer. The father of modern science, Sir Isaac Newton, he's credited with discovering the law of gravity, but many other laws of physics and mathematical calculus. Super smart guy. He wrote in the 1700s that this most beautiful system of the sun, the planets, and the comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. And Sir Isaac Newton, again, is the person we call the father of modern science. You see that scientists are now finding that our universe in which we live has been specifically tweaked to enable life on Earth. Some of the variables that have to be perfect for human life to exist on Earth include things like the oxygen level. If there's too much oxygen in the atmosphere, fires would spontaneously erupt and everything would be fried. If there's not enough oxygen, we all suffocate. It has to be just right for us to live. The carbon dioxide level is the same. The moon, the Earth gravitational interaction, gravity. There's over 100 of these very narrowly defined constants that all are required for human life to exist, and they point to some kind of an intelligent designer. Astrophysicist Hugh Ross, he calculated what would be the probability of these, and there's actually 122 of these constants in all. What would be the chances of all of these things existing in our universe for any single planet by chance? He said it would be 0.1 with 22 zeros behind it. In other words, scientists have been recognizing that the odds of our world just randomly developing in the way it has in order to support our life are astronomical. As Nobel laureate Arno Penzias put it, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which is created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural design. So many of the world's greatest scientists did and do believe in God's existence. We mentioned Albert Einstein, but here's some of the other top scientists that we know believing in God, Sir Francis Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Pascal, Planck, and those are just the ones that fit on a slide. Some of the greatest scientists and greatest thinkers of our time, they recognize that belief in a creator and in scientific methods are not incompatible. We can believe in God and in the importance of science at the same time. These men would say that God created us and gave us the ability to think, to study, to understand, to learn. In other words, God invented and created science. So now somebody might say, perhaps there's a God. Sure, okay, maybe there's a God. And if so, well, sure, he could do whatever he wanted. He could do miracles and whatever. But that is not proof that Jesus did the miracles as described in the Bible. Walking on water, raising the dead, and so on. Fair enough, that's true. In order to make the case that Jesus actually did the miracles as described in the Bible, we're going to have to rely on something else. We're going to need credible eyewitness testimony. So what information do we have about Jesus? And where does it come from? Is it credible? We have records primarily from 4 sources. First is the New Testament of the Bible. Then there's the writings from early church leaders who learned directly from the eyewitness apostles. Third, we have information from outside of the Bible that references these things, including from Jewish and Roman historians. And lastly, there's archaeological discoveries that are constantly ongoing. So let's first take a look at the New Testament. Do we really know who wrote it and when? When was it written? We do. The Gospel according to Mark was written by a man identified as John Mark. Now, John Mark was well known in the early church. He's referred to in the Acts of the Apostles, in the book of Acts, as considered to be a man of means, which meant he had money, which means he was well educated. There was a man named Papias who had known the Apostle John. He studied and learned directly from John, and he was a bishop. He wrote in about the year 125 that this John Mark, was a companion and interpreter for Peter. So in order to interpret for Peter, he'd have to spend time with Peter, and that gave him access to Peter's firsthand eyewitness testimony to everything that Peter had seen. Also, Papias said that Peter was still alive when Mark wrote his gospel. And even that the apostle, meaning Peter, was delighted at the enthusiasm of the people when the gospel was read in the churches. See, the apostles, when they wrote these gospels, they wrote them and used them for the same purpose we do, preaching in their church. Now, Peter died between 64 and 68 AD in Rome. And so the gospel according to Mark then had to be written before then. Again, according to Papias, who said it was written when Peter was still alive. We'll look more about the dating, more at the dating in a minute. One of the reasons we know about the things that were written by Papias and others is due to a man by the name of Eusebius. Eusebius was a biographer for Emperor Constantine. And in addition to writing Constantine's biography, he wrote a 10-book history of the church, chronicling the rise from Jesus' time to Constantine's time, which is just over 300 years. For that reason, Eusebius is called the father of church history. Moving along to Matthew. Matthew is also known as Levi, and he was the brother of the apostle James the Less. Also, as recorded by Eusebius in the early 300s, Papias wrote that Matthew compiled the sayings of Christ in the Hebrew language. There's other references that Matthew may have written it in Greek, and it may have been both, because Matthew probably was the most highly educated of the apostles. He manned an important tax station in Capernaum that would have required him to be able to speak multiple languages, even more than just Greek and so on. And so there's a good chance that he might have written it in several languages. Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father, said that Matthew composed his gospel when Peter and Paul were founding the church in Rome, which obviously means when they were both still alive. So there are early church written references that the apostle Matthew was the author of that gospel, and even when he wrote it. It was never doubted in the early church that Matthew the apostle was the author of that gospel. To back that up with some logic, we all know that Matthew the apostle was a tax collector. And you may know that tax collectors were seen as collaborators with Rome. So the Jewish people despised tax collectors. So much so that tax collectors often had to have bodyguards travel with them to prevent them from being assassinated. And so the point is, if somebody else wrote that gospel, not Matthew, if somebody else wrote it, but they wanted to attach an eyewitness apostle's name to it to give it credibility, why wouldn't they pick almost any other apostle that didn't have all that baggage? In other words, If Matthew the apostle didn't write it, it would be very unlikely as somebody to credit him for it, given the hatred of tax collectors by the Jewish people. In all, the evidence points to the gospel according to Matthew as having been written by Matthew the apostle. Again, we'll talk more about when it was written in a minute. That brings us to Luke. Luke wrote both the gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Some people look at the Acts of the Apostles as like the fifth gospel. Luke takes up right where he left off with Jesus ascending to heaven. In the very beginning of Luke's gospel, he tells us why he's writing and for whom. He dedicates both his gospel and the book of Acts, the Apostles, to a person by the name of Theophilus. And he says this. He said, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write carefully, in order for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the facts concerning the things of which you have been informed. Now, it's not known who this Theophilus was, but he seems to be somebody that may have paid Luke to write a report about Jesus. Now, Luke is not an eyewitness to the events in Jesus' public life, and so where did he get his information from? Well, Luke was a companion and medical advisor, a doctor, for Paul. And he spent a lot of time traveling in time with Paul, and he admired Paul greatly. Now, you may know Paul's story. We don't have time to go into Paul's details about Paul's whole story, but it's fascinating that Paul was a very well-known and highly educated Jewish man who, right after Jesus' death, became like the leading persecutor of Christians, this new movement. And he was on his way to arrest some more Christians and bring them to justice when he had a vision of Jesus, the risen Jesus. And he knocked him down, and he went blind. And in his vision with Jesus, Jesus asked him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And then he told Paul how to get his vision back. 3 days later, Paul got his vision back following Jesus' direction. From that day forward, he went on to become the most prolific evangelist for Christianity ever. And he, again, was a highly well-known, educated Jewish man. So Paul went and 3 years after that event, Paul went and spent 2 weeks in Jerusalem with Peter and with James, learning more about Jesus. So Luke recorded the things that Paul told him that he had learned. But in addition to that, Luke is considered to have been a top-notch historian by other historians, and that he cared deeply about being accurate in what he reported. An example of that is, I mentioned that shipwreck, where Paul's on a boat with 275 other people. When Luke described that shipwreck, he even described the direction the wind was blowing. So historians today are just fascinated with his attention to detail. He's not writing myth, he's giving specifics of daily life. Think about that the next time you hear something read from Luke's gospel in church, that you're hearing words spoken not as a theologian, but as a historian. John Robinson, the author of Redating the New Testament, said this about Luke. He said, "The author of Acts presents himself primarily as a historian, not a theologian." Sir William Ramsay, a Scottish archaeologist and professor, said that Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. Again, this all speaks to Luke's credibility as a source for information. Well, that brings us to John. So who wrote the Gospel according to John? Well, John did. John was part of Jesus' his inner circle, along with Peter and his brother James. And Constantine's historian, again Eusebius, reports on a writing from Clement, Clement said the fourth of the Gospels was written by John, one of the disciples. And he also said that of all those who had been with Jesus, meaning his apostles, only Matthew and John wrote Gospels, which is very much what we have always believed, is that the two apostles that wrote Gospels were Matthew and John, and they're the only ones that have left us that information. To back much of this up, there's an Israeli archaeologist named Rami Arav, and he concluded that the primary author of the Gospel of John was probably written by an eyewitness to the events in Jesus' life, and he was very familiar with the surroundings of Jerusalem. Well, why does he say that? In John's Gospel, 5:2, John describes a healing that Jesus performs on a crippled man, and it takes place at this location on the screen. And these are the words that John uses to describe the healing. He says, "Now at the sheep pool in Jerusalem, there's a place with 5 colonnades, like porticos, and its name in the language of the Jews is Bethesda. The evidence of these 5 porticos, these 5 colonnades, was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD and covered up with rubble. And it was only rediscovered by archaeologists in 1888. So that means whoever wrote the Gospel of John had to be familiar with Jerusalem before 70 AD. And remember that Jesus was crucified between 30 and 33 AD. So Jerusalem was destroyed less than 40 years after that. That's exactly the window of time when John the Apostle would be there to write the Gospel. Remember some of the other things that John, so this Jewish archaeologist is saying, this guy's clearly, whoever wrote this is clearly a witness to some of the events in Jesus' life. Remember some of the other things that John wrote. He wrote that the first person to meet the risen Jesus was Mary Magdalene. John wrote that Jesus appeared to the apostles in the upper room and the doors were locked. First when Thomas wasn't there, and then when he was there, and so on. So when you start looking at, if he's credible in one place, does that mean he's probably credible in the other things that he wrote? John says this about himself at the end of his gospel. He said, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know his testimony is true." Now, just because John says his testimony is true doesn't mean it is, but he's staking his reputation on it. As Craig Bloomberg, the author of the Historical Reliability of the Gospel, says, despite frequent claims to the contrary, evidence remains strong that the Gospels were written by the authors to whom they've traditionally been ascribed, either apostles or close associates of apostles. In the beginning, I said what we need to provide evidence that Jesus did the things that are written about him in the Bible, what we need is eyewitnesses. We have eyewitness testimony. The apostles Matthew and John were writers of the Gospels, and they were eyewitnesses to these events. The Gospel writer Mark was writing what eyewitness Peter told him directly. And Luke is a physician and companion with Paul, and he's considered been a highly accurate historian. So we know largely, we know who wrote these things, and we're going to look at when it was written. But one of the kind of objections that pops up is that, well, as far as these writers and so on, they were clearly followers of Jesus. And so they're biased. They're biased, and they're going to, make stories up to flatter Jesus and so on and so forth. Well, then that brings a question up. So are the writers and our apostles and so on, are they intending to write myth and story to prop up, or are they intending to tell the truth? Let's see what they had to say about that in their own words. Peter said this, "For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses to his majesty." Peter was captured in the Acts of the Apostles as saying, God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of the fact. And John wrote, that from which the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it, and testified to it. Let's talk about dating. I think you're going to see that knowing when they were written is an important point for us to understand. As mentioned in the beginning, one of the myths that's very frequent, very common, is that the Gospels were passed along verbally, the stories about Jesus for many generations, and not being written down for hundreds of years later. Which again, that would create a lot of room. And when you think if that was the case, you'd say, well, how could they remember from being passed along? Things would change, things would be inserted. Is it really accurate or not? I think I'm going to be able to show you that there's a great deal of evidence that all of the New Testament was written not hundreds of years later, but between about a 20 to 40 year window from Jesus' death, keeping in mind again that Jesus died between 30 and 33 AD. Now, the most common and traditional dating of the New Testament by most Bible scholars and so on, that goes back to at least the earliest 20th century, is what you see here. Note that it's something like this. They're similar. If you take a Bible study course, this is often what you're going to hear is dating of when they were written in some kind of window like this. Note that most of them started about 70 AD or later, and there's a reason for that. Note also that these ranges, so like Luke, written somewhere between 70 and 90 AD, there's by no means a firm agreement amongst Bible scholars, as traditional Bible scholars, as to what those ranges should be, where they exactly begin and end, but they're all kind of in this range. But one reason that they're not exactly the same is that you may not realize that there's not a single book in the New Testament that actually dates itself, as far as when it was written, by what's inside. You can date events that they describe. So, Pontius Pilate was in charge of Judea from, a certain, and there's an event he's describing, you can say, okay, that happened at that time. But as far as when the gospel was written, there's nothing inside it. No matter how long you study it, it tells you, okay, it was probably written about here or there. So then how do we know? Then where does the traditional dating come from? Well, primarily came from the process of elimination, using an arbitrary, somewhat arbitrary speculation of dating rather than positive indicators, such as hunches. Hunches about how long the apostles may have preached verbally before finally writing down the first gospel, or how long Mark's may have circulated before Matthew may have picked it up and said, I'm going to write my own for my own reason. Really educated, but hunches still, using a lot of guesswork. However, there is one very solid piece of dating evidence that can tell us what the latest date likely was for when the original Gospels were written, and that is the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. In the year 66 AD, the relations between the Romans and the Jewish people reached a boiling point, and total war broke out, beginning up north in Galilee. And the Romans eventually eliminated that entire Jewish army in the north, and then they worked their way down to Jerusalem. Now, a lot of what we know about the battle for Jerusalem is from a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus. So who was Josephus? Josephus was the commander of that northern army that was wiped out, and he was captured in October of 67. But by the time the Jewish army worked their way down to Jerusalem, he was now being camped out with the Romans outside of Jerusalem, present to be a negotiator, to negotiate with the Jewish people surrounded. After the war was over, he wrote a 7-book history of the Jerusalem war called the Jewish War. In the end of the war, the Romans completely destroyed and burned the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and to this day, and that includes the temple. The only thing that survives of the temple, that gigantic structure we looked at, is the Western Wall that you occasionally see if you've either been there, if you visit the Holy Land, or you see on television people inserting their sins between the stones and so on. That's all that remains of the temple. Now, Josephus tells us that over 1 million Jewish people died in the siege around Jerusalem, even though there were only normally 100,000 people that lived there. But the battle began, the siege where they surrounded and the Romans choked off Jerusalem began in April, and that was just as Passover, just after Passover began. So the Romans strategically let pilgrims that had come to the city to make sacrifice, let them in, and they wouldn't let them out. Their goal was to starve the city of food and water, and it worked, but they still didn't surrender. So Josephus tells us that over 1 million people were either killed or starved to death in Jerusalem during that siege, and tens of thousands of others were captured and made into slaves, which mostly worked in mines. The Jewish aristocracy, most of it, the wealthy, the educated, the people that were in charge of Jerusalem, were either crucified afterwards or they were hauled off to Rome in chains to die in the Roman theaters. So think about this. In 70 AD, the Jewish people not only lost this war, but along with it, their capital city of Jerusalem was completely destroyed, including the temple. And the temple was a spectacular structure. We see here, beautiful, and this is just the top part of it. The temple building, the tall part in the middle, that was also about 10 stories high. It was made of gleaming white marble and gold. And this structure was so important to the Jewish people. It was considered to be the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies. The Jewish people believed this is where heaven and earth touched inside this building and where God resided on earth. And that all goes back to the teachings of Moses. The Jewish people took this very seriously. The only one person could set foot in there one single day of the year, the chief priest, and he would wear a leather belt with a rope attached to it. In case he passed out or had a heart attack or something, they could pull him out because they believed that if anyone else stepped foot in there, they would be struck dead. So this temple is so strong and such a big part of the Jewish faith and their way of life. But the city of Jerusalem was also destroyed, as I mentioned. So Jerusalem was the center of the civic government for Israel. So it's like our Washington, D.C. It was also the center of their social life and their financial center. So it's like their Los Angeles and their New York, and of course the center of the religious life, like the Vatican. For us, all these things wrapped up into one city, and had been that way for the last 600 years. Given all this destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and how important it was to the Jewish people, do you know how many references there are in the New Testament to this cataclysmic event for the Jewish people? Not a word. Nothing. No word of it at all. It's as though it never happened. Jesus was Jewish, obviously. So the temple was obviously very important to him, as well as all the apostles. Paul, the writers of the Gospels, maybe with the exception of Luke. No one's sure about Luke, if he was Jewish or not. But in none of those writings is there any description other than some predictions by Jesus that we'll look at quickly. How could this be? How could it possibly be that with all these Jewish people and their whole world has been destroyed, that they don't even mention this in the Gospels? Explanations for this have been attempted, but the simple and obvious explanation is they hadn't yet occurred. That these events hadn't occurred when these books were written, which means that they had all been written before 70 AD, and that's less than 40 years from Jesus' death. There's more supporting evidence for that, but before we look at that, we should ask ourselves, well, why is it then that more traditional dating all seems to start in 70 AD or later? Well, according to the author of the Redating the New Testament, John Robinson, he said that that later dating scheme really, after 70 AD, is primarily based on the fact that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temples in 3 Gospels. But they're very short and very vague. In Matthew, it says that Jesus was leaving the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Aren't they beautiful and amazing, incredible? He answered them, "You see all these, do you not? I truly say to you, there will not be another stone left upon another that will not be thrown down." And in Mark, it says the same basic thing. And then in Luke, another short, vague prediction, it says, Jesus, when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "The day shall come upon you when your enemies will cast up a bank about you and surround you and hem you in on every side and dash you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you." So Jesus, note that he doesn't say when this is going to happen. Is this 1,000 years from now? Is this, when is this going to, or who does it? Or anything like that. It's very short, very vague. So these are the primary foundation for dating these Gospels at the later time frame in the century. John Robinson, the author of Redating the New Testament, said that, frankly, Bible scholars just refuse to accept that Jesus could predict the destruction of the temple. So therefore, they're just assuming that the Gospels had to be written after they happened after 70 AD. But here's the thing. If you're writing these Gospels, and if you want to insert a couple of these very vague predictions in there to make the case that Jesus was divine, well, there's already all kinds of stories in there about him, all kinds of miracles, including rising from the dead and everything else. Is it really his divinity really depending on these very vague, short predictions? The other thing is, if you're writing these predictions to make the point that Jesus is divine, wouldn't you also include in there somewhere that it actually happened, that actually came true? But there's not a word that it did. So that's a relatively weak argument. As Charles Torrey says, and he's an American scholar, historian, and archaeologist, said it's perhaps conceivable, that maybe one evangelist writing after the year 70 AD, if these were written after 70 AD when this happened, it's maybe conceivable that one of the writers would have not mentioned it, but that all 4 would? Incredible. He says what is shown is that all 4 Gospels are written before 70 AD. And here's to back that up. There's actually lots of points to back this up. In interest of time, there's only one I can show you, and that is in the book of Acts. Luke provides incredible details about Paul's conversion, as we talked about his amazing story about his being converted. Luke writes about Paul's many travels to all the cities and places you see on the map that he goes to help build this following, this church. And he even records the actual words that Paul uses at his trials. Luke is fascinated with Paul. With all these incredible details about Paul, you know what he never does? He never references Paul's death. He's writing as though Paul is still alive. That can only mean that Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles when Paul was still alive. And that's a key factor for us in dating the Gospels, because Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, because Paul was put to death between 61 and 67 AD in Rome. So that means that Luke must have written the Acts then, again, before that, before 60 AD to the late 50s. And remember that he wrote the Acts after he wrote his Gospel. So that pushes up when the Gospel would have been written to maybe the mid-50s. And most Bible scholars believe that Luke based some of his Gospel on the already circulating Gospels of Mark and or Matthew. So that pushes them up as to when they would have to be written. So you can kind of see where this is going. So this is what the dating looks like according to John Robinson in his 1976 book. He said there's no reason, there's nothing that would tell us that they couldn't have been written even as early as 40 to 45 AD. When you remove that the year 70 item of predictions, this is what the evidence really begins to show. Carsten Thied, a leading German authority on ancient manuscripts and co-author of Eyewitness to Jesus, grows a growing list of modern biblical scholars who agree with this earlier dating, including renowned American archaeologist and biblical scholar William Albright. So why ultimately does it matter when these were written? Because the dating of when these were written means that not only were the eyewitness apostles the likely authors, as we've got other testimony to, but also, very importantly, that there's a great many of eyewitnesses that were at these events that are being written about that are still alive, to testify to these things or to contradict them. So think about Lazarus being raised from the dead in Bethany. Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem, closer than Quincy is to Boston. So when these are being preached, a person that's only 20 years old watching these events take place, now when these are being preached, is only 35 to 50 years old. And the person could speak up and say, hey, time out. I'm from Bethany, and there's never been a Lazarus that's ever lived there. I don't know if it's a made-up story. Or, Lazarus died, and he's still dead. You want me to take you down to his grave site? Or, yeah, I was there when Jesus raised Lazarus, and it was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. So these eyewitnesses are still alive when these are being preached. And that's pretty powerful, I think. So now let's turn our attention to the evidence that's outside of the Bible. So we're going to look briefly at some testimony from a few of the students of the apostles. And actually, there's a lot of information from the students of the apostles, but we're just going to look at 2 of those here today. The first being from Clement of Rome from the 1st century. He was the bishop of Rome, and his letter to the Corinthian church is generally considered to be the earliest reported Christian writing outside of the New Testament, dated about 95 AD. In it, Clement wrote this. He said, Jesus Christ was sent forth from God, so then Christ is from God, and the apostles are from Christ. Also, having been fully assured through the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so on. So again, outside of the Bible, about 60 years after Jesus' death, Clement calls Jesus the Christ, and he states his belief that Jesus was resurrected. Polycarp was another disciple of John, a well-known disciple, and he lived between 70 and 156 AD. In his letter to the Philippians in about 110 AD, he wrote of Jesus having endured to come so far as death for our sins, whom God raised, and that God raised our Lord Jesus Christ from the dead and gave him glory and a throne on his right hand. So again, whom God raised. What's also interesting is that we see that the theology that Jesus died for our sins was not something developed by the church hundreds of years later, that the church evolved into this and said, no. This is what the earliest followers of Jesus believed. Okay, well, so then how about some testimony from people who were not followers of Jesus? Let's take from outside of the Bible. Let's look at a Jewish source. We've already talked about that former Jewish general turned Roman historian Josephus. And he not only wrote about the Jewish Roman War ending in 70 AD, but he also wrote a 10-book history of the Jewish people. And in that set of books, he makes a mention of Jesus. He says this about Jesus, that at this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man. He was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following among many Jews and among many of the Greek origin. When Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so, and up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. So here was confirmed by this outside source of a non-believer is that Jesus performed miracles. He called them startling deeds. It confirms that Jesus taught the people, had many followers, was crucified on a cross, and his people still continue to worship him to that day. All of these things match exactly what we read in the Bible. How about some Roman historians? Suetonius is a Roman historian and the chief secretary for Emperor Hadrian between 117 and 138 AD. And he wrote about the Emperor Claudius earlier had put down a riot in Rome in the year 49, saying, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from the city. So this means that Christianity had developed a significant following in Rome within just 15 to 20 years after Jesus' death. Rome is on the other side of the Mediterranean from Jerusalem. What was it that Jesus did that had such an impact on people that this spread to the seat of power for the Roman Empire? So much so that the emperor had to start kicking them out of the city. Another Roman historian, Tacitus, He was a Roman historian born in 55 AD, and he lived through the reigns of about half dozen Roman emperors. And he's been called the greatest Roman historian. He lived in ancient Rome. He recorded at least one reference to Christ and early Christianity, and this one was written after Nero's death in about 115 AD, and it refers to the great fire that Nero had suspicions put on Nero. And so Tacitus writes this: consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea. That superstition by his followers was that Jesus rose from the dead. So this Roman historian, considered to be the greatest Roman historian, wrote in about 115 AD about the story that Pontius Pilate executed Jesus and that the followers of Jesus believed he had risen from the dead. And again, not only in Judea, not only in Israel, but all the way around the Mediterranean, heavily in Rome. And how about another Roman? Pliny the Younger, a Roman author and administrator, in a letter that he wrote to Emperor Trajan in about 112 AD, so about 80 years after Jesus' death, Pliny describes the early Christian worship practices to the emperor. He said this, he said, they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, probably Sunday, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God and bound themselves by solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, after which was their custom to partake of food of an ordinary kind. Clearly bread and wine, right? So this Roman administrator was writing to the emperor about 80 years after Jesus' death that Jesus' followers considered him to be the Christ, and they sang songs to him as to a God. America's most famous atheist author, Bart Ehrman, conceded in his 2014 book, How Jesus Became God, that belief in Jesus as a quasi-divine being began very early in the Jesus movement. So back to one of those fallacies I mentioned about the Da Vinci Code in the beginning, that Jesus' followers didn't believe he was the divine until the year 325 of the Council of Nicaea and all that. We just showed you directive evidence from not only Christian writers and Christians, but even Romans, that his followers believed he was divine from the earliest point. So we've looked at who wrote these Gospels. We looked at when they were written. We've looked at some information from outside of the Bible. But how do we know we should believe this information? Is it credible? I mean, is it made up? Is it fantasy? Or are there any indicators that would give us a sense that this really happened, that these writings were true? I think one of the more powerful indicators of the credibility of the New Testament is that it was women. It was women who were the first to discover the empty tomb and the risen Jesus in all four Gospels. So why is that important? Well, in the Jewish culture at the time, a woman's testimony was considered to be practically worthless. It was not accepted in court. So let's think about this for a second. The writers of the Gospels are telling the story about the most important thing to ever happen in all of human history. That a man who was crucified, died, and buried for 3 days, rose from under his own power, proving that he was the Son of God. And then they write that the first people he ran into were women in a time and place in the world where women were second-class citizens. They had a very low standing. Why would they do that? If they're making these stories up and they're writing to basically a male-controlled world, why would they say that the first people to meet this risen Jesus, if they're making the story, were women? They could have said it was one of the other apostles, Joseph of Arimathea. They could have made somebody up. Joe Schmo. Jesus ran into Joe Schmo in the street. But they didn't. They wrote it was women. Why would they do that? They just wrote down what happened. It's that simple. In fact, all the Gospels are really written in that manner. They're not really written to spare embarrassment for the apostles in any way, shape, or form. There's a lot of embarrassment to the apostles in the Gospels. One obvious one, and a big one, is Peter. What's he do in the courtyard? Jesus is there. He's been arrested. He's being questioned harshly. And what's Peter do? He denies he even knows Jesus 3 times. And then when he's accused of being a follower, he cusses at the man. And then what's he do? He goes off and weeps bitterly. If you're writing a story to try to build up the apostles and try to launch a religion or something like that, if you think that's what it was, well, it's clear they weren't really, propping Peter up on a pedestal. Before we move on to the last key arguments, I'd like to show you what are considered to be really agreed facts that are generally agreed by most historians and Bible scholars across the spectrum of liberal and conservative and so on religiously. Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried in a private tomb. His tomb was discovered empty a few days later. His disciples had experiences they believe were literally appearances of the risen Jesus. And because of those experiences, his disciples transformed from being doubters and scared and afraid to being bold proclaimers of his death and resurrection. And that resurrection was the center of their teaching in the early church. History provides us with an indisputable fact that no source has ever disputed. And that is that the tomb in which Jesus' body was laid in on Friday, what we call Good Friday, was missing on Sunday, what we call Easter Sunday. In fact, the Jewish elders didn't even deny that the tomb was empty. They said, well, Jesus' followers came and took the body when the guards were asleep. And obviously, no one could logically preach that Jesus rose if his body was still inside the tomb. So it's clear and it's obvious fact that the tomb was empty. The question is, what happened to the body? There's really only 5 things that could have happened to Jesus' body after it was laid in the tomb. Did Joseph of Arimathea secretly move the body for some reason? Thieves took the body. Pharisees or Romans took the body. The apostles took it. Or, well, none of the above. Let's look at these one at a time. First, Joseph of Arimathea. Now, he knew where the body was. It was his tomb, so he knew where the body was. And John's gospel tells us that Joseph was a secret admirer, a follower, secret follower, disciple of Jesus. But by requesting Jesus' body to be buried in his own tomb, he already outed himself, if you will, to the other men in the Sanhedrin. And so he would have already been incurring whatever wrath he's going to receive by his associates. So what would be the point of him moving the body now that he's already people are recognizing that he's a follower? Besides that, he would have had to deal with the guards, the Roman guards that are there, right? And even if he had tried to bribe them, they would never accept a bribe because sleeping on duty was punishable by death by the Romans. So no bribe would be worth that taking. No bribe would be worth taking. So it's clear that Joseph of Arimathea really had no motivation to move the body at this point, but he certainly wouldn't be able to because of the Romans. Okay, well, how about thieves? If thieves raided the tomb, they'd be after burial clothes and items of value, not the body. In fact, the body would even be a hindrance to them, right? Besides that, for thieves, they could obviously just wait it out. They could say, look, these guys aren't going to guard a dead body forever. Wait till the guards are gone, then we'll raid the tomb. But by Sunday, the body's already gone, so it's clear it's not thieves. Okay, that brings us to the Pharisees and the Romans. Now, they had the power. They were the only ones that really had the power to move the body, but why would they do it? The Pharisees went to great lengths, remember, to arrest Jesus, they put up a phony trial against their own rules at nighttime and so on to find him guilty, and then to get the Romans to condemn him to death. It took a lot of effort. They didn't want him missing. They wanted his body dead, buried, and forgotten. And the same with the Romans. The Romans feared Jesus' ability to generate crowds and followings. There's over 1 million people that have come to the city for Passover. So they also wanted Jesus dead and buried and gone. That's why the Pharisees asked for the guard to be placed there, and that's why the Romans approved it. But here's the thing. Even if they had moved it for any reason, if they thought, hey, we heard a rumor that somebody's going to try to take Jesus' body, so we're going to be proactive. Let's move the body somewhere else before they do. Well, they could easily reproduce the body then, right? Well, Sunday morning when Jesus' followers are saying that Jesus rose from the dead, they could have easily said, no, here's his body. And if they did, we wouldn't be here talking today. So that never happened. So that leaves us with the apostles taking the body. So let's look at this possibility. Again, it's the official story from the Pharisees. They said that Jesus' followers came and took the body at night while the guards were sleeping in Matthew's gospel. Now, there's all kinds of problems with this explanation. First off, if Jesus' followers took the body while the guards were sleeping, how could they really see who took it? And they never claimed that there was a battle. No, they said they were sleeping. So, that's questionable. It's also highly likely the guards would all be asleep. As noted earlier, the Roman punishment for sleeping on duty was death. And the Romans took their their business very, very seriously. Now, a Roman, quote, guard that's described in other places that guarded the city gates, as an example, always consisted of at least 4 soldiers. 3 that would stand duty while 1 rested. They were all armed with a sword, a spear, and a shield. The chances of all the guards being asleep would be extremely unlikely, especially considering that Pilate himself gave the order for this, even though they're guarding a dead body, it's kind of a high-profile thing at the time. And of course, we know the passion of the Jewish followers in the Sanhedrin. They wanted to make sure this was taken care of. Now, as noted in Matthew, the Pharisees paid the guards for this story. And it really rings true if you think about it, because the guards have never come forward with a story that entailed them sleeping if they weren't given assurances ahead of time that you're not going to be punished, right? It seems relatively obvious. But again, given it's the official story, let's look at it just a little bit closer. So, Jesus' followers, the apostles, they're in hiding. They're afraid to be next to be arrested, and they're scared. And they're in mourning. Their friend they've spent the last 3 years with is dead, and they're confused. Just until a couple of days ago, they thought this man was the promised Messiah, and now he's been put to death. And these apostles, they're not soldiers. They're fishermen. Matthew's basically an accountant as a tax collector. Instead of fighting back when Jesus was arrested, most of them ran and hid. In fact, in Mark's gospel, he wrote, they all left him and ran away. So do they sound like they had the courage to go up and battle the Romans for this body? But again, let's take this just a little bit further. So if we suppose that the apostles are in this upper room and they're scared and they're depressed and they start drinking some wine and they get their wine muscles, hey guys, let's go down there and get that body. Let's do it. Come on, those guys aren't going to stop us. Well, they must have felt very lucky when they got there, right? And found that all the guards are sound asleep. Oh, thank goodness, they're asleep. Great. But they wouldn't have had to contend with this. All 4 Gospels describe a gigantic stone that blocked the entrance to the tomb. And this is traditional in Jerusalem, and these were designed to keep those thieves out from stealing things. Remember, the women were concerned about how we're going to move the stone to finish the burial wrappings. They probably were going to need some help. So, but if we assume, though, that somehow, okay, they get there, the guards are asleep, and somehow the apostles are very quietly able to roll this stone away and get inside with the guards still asleep. John tells us in his gospel that when he arrives, he pokes his head in, and the body wrapping is laying in one place, and the headscarf is folded up and sitting in another spot. Just a footnote of what he saw. Wasn't really intended to be a clue for us some 2,000 years later, but it really just points us in the right direction, I think, because if the followers of Jesus did actually take the body, when they're to take the body, why would they take the time to take the body wrapping off when the guards are just asleep just outside the door, and time to fold up the headscarf? And of course, for what? And I should mention that the body wrapping would be stuck to his bloody wounds, right? And myrrh that adheres to the body. For what? To carry a naked body through the streets of Jerusalem? Remember, this is the official story that the Pharisees said took place, and none of it makes any sense whatsoever. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is what would be the purpose of Jesus' followers to take the body? What could they possibly hope to gain? I mean, they didn't get any book or movie deals. They didn't get wealthy. They didn't, get invited to all the right parties now. No, they went on to leave their families and how they made a living in supporting their families to do what Jesus asked them to do, to go and spread the word of God. And what earthly rewards did they get for this? They often went without food in their travels. They slept exposed outside to the elements frequently. They're ridiculed. They're persecuted. They're beaten. They're stoned. Eventually, almost all of them are arrested and tortured and threatened with death if they would not stop preaching about Jesus. So it seems very clear that Joseph of Arimathea, he didn't really have a motivation to move the body, but he wouldn't have been able to take it anyways with the Roman guards there. Thieves, they couldn't take it. The Romans are Pharisees. They had no reason to move it, but even if they did, they could have reproduced the body, right? And Jesus' followers, no motivation to take it, and they clearly didn't have access and the ability to do it. So that leaves really just one explanation. The one that is the reason we still come to church, 2,000 years later, the one that many men died telling. So what became of the apostles? When we think about credibility of our information and the testimony, we look for signs that would tell us that what they said is true. Think about a crime scene. Police arrive at a crime scene and they start questioning the witnesses. And there's a witness here says, yeah, the person fell down. What do the police do? They observe that person's actions, their behaviors, what they do. Are they acting normal or they're acting kind of strange? It starts to tell them something's not right. So is there anything about the apostles and their behavior that gives us some clues? Well, what did they do after Jesus was crucified? Did they go back to their lives, go back to their families, their jobs and so on, lie low and beneath the radar of persecution and kind of try to get back to their lives as normal? Absolutely not. Thanks to Roman ships, roads, and security, frankly, it made it possible for the apostles to travel the known world, spreading the word of God as Jesus commanded them to do. This slide shows where many of them are believed to have gone and preaching, and this is not the only places, but these are the ones that are the most well documented. And it also shows the method that most of them were put to death. Some of those deaths were really quite gruesome. They died in a wide variety of places, in fact. Now, somebody might say, okay, it's not unheard of, though, for people to die for something that they believe passionately in. Soldiers do it, police and firefighters sometimes, first responders, and other brave people. In some situation is thrust on them, and they have to make an instant decision about doing what's right and what they have to do. So why are the apostles any different? Well, this is true. People do sometimes willingly make the ultimate sacrifice for something that they believe in. But all of us here know a truth about all men and women that applies to all people everywhere, always. And that is that people don't willingly die and go to their death for something that they know is a lie. They've never done it, and they never will. And so given that these men all gave up their lives willingly for their witness about Jesus, what does that tell us? Early in the presentation, I raised the question about, again, how do you tell if the witnesses are telling the truth or not? Well, let's imagine we're in a courtroom and you're jurors in this courtroom, and there's a witness on the stand over here. And you know that he's not gaining anything from his testimony. He hasn't sold a bunch of books or something. And in fact, he's actually suffering greatly in his personal life because of his testimony. But now he's been beaten over it, jailed over it, and now he's being threatened with his very life if he won't change his story. But he said he's willing to die rather than change his story. Do you believe his testimony? Here's something that our careful historian, Luke, says. In my first book, I told you, Theophilus, during the 40 days after his crucifixion, he appeared to the apostles from time to time, and he proved to them in many ways that he was actually alive. And again, as atheist author Bart Ehrman even concludes, Jesus' followers, or at least some of them, came to believe that God had done a great miracle and restored Jesus to life. And again, he's judging based on the behavior of what the apostles did afterwards. I'd like to wrap up the presentation with just a final note about Peter, who was in Jesus' most inner circle. He saw every major event in Jesus' public ministry. After Peter left Jerusalem, he made the Greek city of Antioch his headquarters before eventually going to Rome to help build the church there. In Rome, he was eventually arrested by Emperor Nero between 64 and 67 AD. It was a time of really horrendous persecution of Christians. And he was put in this prison, Mamertine prison. It's the oldest prison in Rome and still in existence. And so you can visit it if you're there on vacation or whatever. So it was a maximum security prison for enemies of Rome awaiting execution. And it was originally a cistern, so it had two levels. The lower level was where high-profile prisoners like Peter were kept. And no natural light ever entered that lower level, and it was never, ever cleaned. Can you imagine the filth? This is the actual hole that leads down to that lower level. Peter's imprisoned there for a horrific 9 months, manacled in an upright position so he could not lie down or rest. But even so, tradition has it that he converted his jailers and at least 47 others to Christianity in his time when he was there. So Peter is being held in this hellish prison for almost an entire year of his life. He would not recant his testimony about Jesus in order to be freed. So he's eventually sentenced to death. And as many of you know, he said he wasn't worthy to die in the same way as his Lord. So he requested to be crucified upside down, and that was granted. That crucifixion took place in Nero's Circus Maximus, where they ran chariot races and that sort of thing, during a spectacle that included slaves and gladiators. Peter was relatively well known in Rome, kind of a celebrity. The Christians took his body when he was dead and buried it in the cemetery near the circus, and that very spot where he was buried is now under what is St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. So anyone who came here tonight looking for evidence with hard facts, give me something I can sink my teeth into that really shows that Jesus truly rose from the dead. Well, then remember this one absolute, guaranteed, indisputable, ironclad fact. And that is Peter, who saw everything, he believed it. He clearly, without doubt, believed it and went to his death believing it, as did many other apostles and their followers. So as we've seen, there is very sound evidence to accept and believe that God does truly exist, scientific evidence, and therefore that miracles are actually possible. And we have credible eyewitness testimony that Jesus truly rose from the dead. It really happened. I'd like to thank you all for your time today, and God bless you. Thank you.